Are we on? Shabbat Shalom, everybody. So I wanted to frame our class today with a favorite little moment of mine from one of my favorite sermons from Andy Stanley, who's the great preacher in Atlanta. And he's talking to college kids. There's a whole coliseum of 20, 22, 23-year-olds. And he's talking to them about how the single biggest determinant of their future, of their lives, is can they control their appetites. And he said appetites are just so powerful and so constant. And the only time your appetite's not gnawing on you and bothering you is when you're dead. As long as you're alive, your appetite's always going to be bothering you, gnawing on you, tempting you. And you could go to a whole convention and praise Jesus 24 hours a day, and you walk out and your appetites are going to be gnawing on you. And the text that he says, if you can control your appetites, there's no limit to the good you can do. And if you can't control your appetites, there's no limit to the tragedy of how broken your life can be. And then the text that he brings is Esau selling his entire birthright, all the blessings, for a pot of stew, for a bowl of stew. And he says, when you first read this, you think, who would ever do a thing like that? Who would give up everything for nothing? Who would give up everything for a bowl of stew? And then he says, the answer is you would, I would, we would, we do. And he just talks about, and all of us know this, every day there's stories of this, of people who trade in everything, their life, their career, their reputation, their family, for a bowl of stew. Who would do a thing like that? Answer, we would. And I always kept that in my mind about this flip of taking a text that feels like it's an interesting text, but a less than kind of text, because who would ever do a thing like that? And then the flip is we all would, we all do. And in a moment, we'll talk about how that exact flip applies to Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac. Let's pray together, thanking God for the gift of learning Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. V'haref na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu u'b'fi amcha be'Yisrael. V'nihiyah anachnu v'tzatza'enu v'tzatza'ei amcha be'Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha v'lovdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai, hamalamed Torah li'amo Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai, noten ha'Torah. So, who would ever do a thing like that? Was the critique that, as I mentioned in the teaser, Simon Greenberg is a great teacher of rabbis at the seminary for 50 years. He would always say this story, Genesis 22, who would ever do a thing like that? What parent would ever put anything above the welfare of their child? Who would do a thing like that? And as a result, Rabbi Greenberg, who was also a great preacher and great homiletics instructor, he said, just don't even go there. Don't even try to teach it, because it's the fundamental premise that a parent would love something more than they love their own child is just something that none of your congregants could ever relate to. And then this Andy Stanley flip, we all would. We all do. Our nation does every day. So here's what I want to do. Colleagues, I want to just read a little bit of this and ask you what echoes it presents to you as you think about this text in the light of Columbine, followed by Newtown, followed by Parkland, and in this unholy listing, we then usually go from Parkland to Uvalde. But as I mentioned in the teaser that I got from the Daily, with the reporter David Goodman, who can even keep track of these things, there was another school shooting between Parkland and Uvalde in Texas, in Santa Fe, Texas, a school shooting. 10 people died, and then Uvalde. So, and you think about how all of this happens, one after another, our children dead. What echoes does this present? So, sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test, saying to him, Abraham, he answered, here I am. Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass, took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his servants, "You stay here with the ass. The boy and I will go up there. We will worship, and we will return to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. He himself took the firestone and the knife, and the two walked off together. Then Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he answered, "Yes, my son." And he said, "Here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "It is God who will see to the sheep for this burnt offering, my son." And the two of them walked on together. They arrived at the place of which God had told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Then a messenger of Adonai, a malach in Hebrew, an angel, called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." And he answered, "Here I am." "Do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me." When Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. Now, that's a familiar story. What does it say to us now? Mr. Nesson.
I was thinking about your opening, this morning, and thinking about who are people that might, put their children in front of, behind other things, and I'm thinking, I know people that have addictions. I know that that so many times you hear about people with addictions that will put up their children, either try to sell them or to abuse them in other ways. So people that are somewhat broken, which is so interesting because it's not Abraham. It's not Abraham, but people that are somewhat broken will oftentimes not oftentimes use their children as ways of making income so that they can actually support their addictions. People that are gamblers, drug addicts, that kind of thing. This is not the same story, but I was just trying to imagine anybody that would actually do that.
I don't think you have to go that far, though. I think that there's a way in which when you become a passionate believer, it's easy to sacrifice your willingness to think critically in the moment for the adherence to the ideology or to the group think. And that's something that, we've had that conversation often in here where Wes, you'll often say, like, how do you not see the murder, the tragedy, the horror in the text? And we'll take, often Michelle and I, or just Michelle will be like, the traditional read, here's the traditional read, and the rabbis see it this way, and we're so attached to that rabbinic read. And it's not, there's a goodness in that. There's a way in which when you align with groupthink, when you align with a political party, it protects you. Ideally, it helps you to make choices without needing to fully understand everything that's going on. But at the same time, it endangers you because when you adhere so strongly to that groupthink, your own critical thinking is turned off and the sacrifice ends up being your child.
Yeah. Aliza, if you can step into the mindset of a parent in Texas or Oklahoma that has made, after Santa Fe and after Walmart and after a church shooting in Texas, it's now officially easier than ever to buy an assault rifle. And the killer in Uvalde bought his assault rifle at the age of 18, totally legally, given the laws of the state, after the church shooting, after Walmart, and after the Santa Fe, in which 10 were murdered. Here's my question. I would say to them, you are putting something ahead of the welfare of children, which is how Uvalde came to be. You're putting gun rights and putting the Second Amendment ahead of the welfare of children, like Abraham does here, the voice of God. Problematic. I would say, by the way, Dan, P.S., note to file, Abraham's broken in this story. I think ipso facto, per se, if you put something ahead of the welfare of a child who is dependent and counting on you, whatever you put ahead of the child, you're broken by definition. Abraham's very broken here, but that's a separate conversation. But back to Texas and back to our life, our tragic country now. Can you step in the head of a person who, after Walmart, church shooting, Santa Fe shooting, says the answer is we need more guns? And I would say to you, you're putting the welfare of guns ahead of the welfare of children, because I can't imagine they would say, yeah, that's what we're doing. They would have a different approach. Could you just frame that for us?
Of course. Guns don't kill children. People kill children. And what happened in Uvalde was a direct result of incompetence and rules that were broken. If the door had been kept locked, if proper protections had been in place, if people had responded to this child who was clearly trying out a need. You know, he's 18, but he's still a kid. If his girlfriend had reported him, if anyone had reported him, this wouldn't have happened. And guns make us safer. Guns enable us to protect ourselves. And if you take away our right to guns, you take away our self-protection that's enshrined in the Constitution. It's not about our children. This is about, it's not that having the guns endangers our children. Having these guns protects our children. That's what we've always done.
But the Second Amendment is so misread. I mean, it says that you can weapons to arm a militia against against attack. So it's not just anyone could have a gun.
Right.
And to be clear, I don't agree with that position.
But Elisa, but can I just ask a question about that? And then Michelle, I want to get your voice in a minute. What do you do as a country with that? Like, what do you do with that? Because if that voice were here, I don't know how I at least could dialogue with that voice. So how do you build a country where you have such antithetical voices that are unbridgeable?
I was just reading this morning about Jacobs, who is not running for re-election from Buffalo, who came out saying that we needed to have a ban on assault rifles, which is limited in terms of its scope, but his political career is totally sabotaged based on taking a stand in favor of gun restrictions, not even getting rid of all guns, just assault rifles.
The sensible restrictions against gun rifles, right.
Yeah.
So, and just one last thing on that, which is, it is tempting to do what Steve Kerr did last week in the clip, which is to blame the cowardly politicians, the cowardly Republican politicians, but that really is a cop-out. That's the symptom of the problem. The problem is that our countrymen, our fellow citizens, take the position that you articulated, so many millions do, that we keep having these. And my question is, it feels to me like a clear example of placing something above the welfare of your own child, and I don't know how to be in citizenship with people who do that. Michelle?
So one of the most sort of spectacular unclarities or confusions about this text is how old Isaac is. And he is either a child, and how could you do this to a child, or he is a young man who is going along on his own will. And it seems to me that that's one of the blind spots that we have when we think about guns, when we think about violence of any kind in our nation, that we forget to look at the people in Buffalo in the same way that we would look at those amazing kids in Uvalde. There's something about our human spirit that can't remember that children grow up to be adults who continue to be precious to all of us. And there's, I think, a really profound teaching of this text that we need to hold on to that idea that all of us are vulnerable. And now to your question, I have a different answer than Eliza. I think that one of the things that pops out at me about this text this morning is Abraham has this hopefulness in him, another complexity in the text. What does he mean that there's going to be a sheep? What does it mean that there's going to be something there to slaughter? Does he really think that? Does he really believe that? Is he just reassuring his son? But in some sense, what I hear out of Texas is exactly this Abraham move, like, don't worry, it's going to be okay. Yes, we're in a very dangerous situation, but that dangerous situation is very limited, and it's very, it barely happens. We can protect against that limited situation. There's a global concept at play, and I have hope that it will all work out okay. So if I'm a gun owner in Texas, perhaps I'm doing the Abraham move of believing that somehow God or the world or the universe will protect my family, my kid. This isn't going to happen here.
And note, just on that, on the text, how utterly passive Isaac is. We don't know how old he is, but in the text, he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham laid Isaac on the altar on top of the wood. There's no hint of any kind of resistance or, Dad, what are you doing? Dad, what the hell are you doing? Dad, WTF, and fighting. No, I mean, it's just completely passive. And that suggests the passivity of our children who are just completely done to. Done too. Elias?
I have several thoughts about this. One is I cannot stop thinking about the kids who in all these schools survive, right? That were not the victims. 15 years from now, what will be their attitude towards life? Will it be, I'm protesting against guns, or for sure, I'm going to buy a gun because I need to protect myself for possible events like that. So it's something that it's sticking in my mind. What's the reaction of the future generation regarding this? And the second thing that it's more in the line of spirituality that Michelle brings here is one of the typical, famous words of this text in Hebrew is hineni. Okay, and I compare the hineni with the beautiful prayer that you love doing in High Holidays, the hineni. And the hineni in the High Holy is completely different to this text. The hineni in the High Holy it's I'm not putting my needs in front of anybody. You know, I'm representing the congregation here, and it's actually the opposite. Who am I to represent the congregation? So I'm putting my prayers on the side to pray on behalf of the other people. And here, Abraham, the hineni in this text is completely different.
Right.
Is yes, I'm a devoted religious person, and I'll do anything you ask me, God.
Right. I wanna bring into this an insight that Michelle had when we were thinking about this class, which is the contrast between the American experience of our American kids who are sent off to war in their classrooms. You know, they're 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, and they're sent off to war in all these classrooms: Columbine, Parkland, Uvalde, Santa Fe, etc., and Israel and Israelis. And Michelle, could you frame that for us? And then I want to take a look at the Danny Gordis piece that I included here.
I mean, first of all, I want to say there's such a different perspective towards guns and to guns in Israel.
Please
really,
say more.
In Israel, as far as I understand it, if you would like to have a gun, you need to go through an intensive experience of training in that use of that gun. You need to be permitted for that gun. You need to be accountable for every single bullet that comes out of that gun. It is taken very seriously, and apparently it's a very long process. It's not something that you can just walk in on your 18th birthday and have this happen, although of course all Israelis walk in on their 18th birthday and are given guns, right? In their 18th birthday as they join the military.
Right.
But that is considered to be not a right. It is a responsibility. And it's a responsibility that is really drilled into all of their heads, comes within a collective construct of not right, but responsibility, of ultimate responsibility that is about protecting someone else and not about engaging in video game violence of sort of an unhinged mind who is acting out their anger and frustrations. So what do I do with that? I think some of the challenge that we have in America comes from this perspective that we have a right to these guns versus that we have a responsibility, and that the right is about an individual and the responsibility is about a collective. And so Danny Gordis writes about the collective responsibility of having a gun and what that means to be part of a people who need guns. Same argument Eliza was making, the guns make us more safe, but it's about the protection of a collective.
Right. So I want to just double click on this, because that insight you brought, Michelle, when we talked about it, the Israeli experience, was really helpful to me in clarifying what I think about our own tormented country here. In Israel, obviously, Israeli society sends its 18-year-olds off to war, where they have to learn how to use guns. In the Danny Gordis piece that I sent in the Talmud teaser, and Elias was asking what's the relevance of this, Danny juxtaposes two iconic photographs. There's the photograph of the young Jewish boy in Nazi Germany with his hands up and a Nazi guard with a gun, right? And then there's the iconic photograph of the three soldiers reclaiming, reclaiming the Kotel. Yom Yerushalayim was last Sunday. And Danny Gordis's piece is one of those photographs is our lot as a Jewish people. We're either going to be constantly, a gun is going to be to our back, and we're going to be killed, massacred, murdered, and decapitated, and expelled, and pogromized. That's see 2,000 years of Jewish history. Or we have our own army, and we fight back. And Danny's point is that you can't. Jewish history teaches us anything. It teaches us that we actually need guns. Otherwise, guns will be aimed at us. We either need to learn how to own guns and fire guns and have an army and have a sovereign state and have a military to defend our right to exist, or the boy who has a Nazi guard at his back with a gun, that's going to be our fate. And therefore, in that context, and this was very binding of Isaac, Danny Gordis talks about driving his kid in the piece off to his Israeli service, and it was very Abraham Isaac. The kid was going to fight so that the Jewish state could exist. And that's a case in which case parents are putting the welfare of their children at risk, right? Here's a father literally driving his son to the army base where, God forbid, things could happen. And yet he does it for a principle, namely survival of the Jewish state. And I wanted to bring, and then I was contrasting that to and Michelle, thank you for the footnote there, that other than that, Israelis are not a gun culture. They're not a gun culture, right? It's soldiers who are defending the state who have guns, but private citizens do not have guns. Private citizens do not have guns. Right. And in our country, there's just this weird, lamentable, tragic, literally tragic fixation with guns.
Well, there's a difference, though, because the father driving his son to the Miluim is doing something that he did also. In other words, he put himself in danger for the state as well. And I think that's it. It's not exactly the same.
Fair point. Yeah. Right. I mean that. Right. Right. Israelis serve as soldiers, and then when they age out, their kids serve as soldiers.
Well, but you could say the same thing, right? Somebody who's a gun owner, whose grandfather was a gun owner, who's going to teach you see these things about people teaching their toddlers how to shoot guns. That's a family thing. I think, Dan, it matters what context it's in. When you learn how to shoot a gun within the context of the military, you learn about the responsibilities inherent in that gun. When you learn to shoot a gun as a toddler, you may or may not.
Now, tell me if I'm missing something. And one of the, there's a lot of healthy diversity usually here, but I'm wondering if there's any diversity on here. It just feels to me like the Israeli practice and relationship to guns is so much healthier, so much more life-affirming than America's relationship to guns. It feels to me like America's relationship to guns is deeply sick and deeply dysfunctional and results in a lot of dead children and a lot of dead civilians, churchgoers, and grocery shoppers and people in Tulsa office building, etc. And the relationship of guns in Israel is deeply sane and grounded and healthy. I mean, it's sad.
In almost any other country in the world.
Right. You don't need to go that far to cross the ocean to find countries who don't allow, To me, all this is foreign because I grew up in a country that it's illegal to buy a gun.
Yeah, tell us the Argentina deal.
Argentina has other issues because the police is so corrupt that they have the guns and you are so scared of them. They are not there to protect you. But in terms of mass shooting, that's completely unknown.
You don't have that in Argentina.
No.
Yeah. So I wanted to read this idea that Israeli kids are, in fact, Isaac, but actually worse off than Isaac, is in our Lev Shalem Machzor. It's on page 3 of the handout. Chaim Guri is an Israeli, and he wrote this poem exactly on this issue of Isaac and the fact that Isaac is in fact every generation of Israeli, but Isaac was luckier than every generation of Israeli. So, Michelle, could you read that? This is on page 3, Heritage by Chaim Guri.
Heritage. The ram came last of all, and Abraham did not know that it came to answer the boy's question, first of his strength when his day was on the wane. The old man raised his head. Seeing that it was no dream that the angel stood there, the knife slipped from his hand. The boy, released from his bonds, saw his father's back. Isaac, as the story goes, was not sacrificed. He lived for many years, saw what life's pleasures had to offer until his eyesight dimmed. But he bequeathed that hour to his offspring. They are born with a knife in their hearts.
What is your reaction to that poem? Yeah. Yeah. For me, it's a double yeah, which is I get that Israelis are born with a knife in their hearts. I just don't get why Americans have to be born with a knife in their hearts. It feels like in Israel, the relationship to war and that you have to serve and you have to do miluim, etc., is an essential requirement for the state to survive. And in our case, it feels like an unwise choice, addiction, pattern, etc. So I guess I want to ask you, as this is playing out, and of course, and we've all read articles about how every time there's a mass shooting, there's this whole civic ritual of outcry and hue and cry, and whoever happens to be president gives a speech, and now is the time to act, and then nothing ever happens until the next mass shooting, right? Because millions of Americans love their guns. So here's my question. What does that do to your attitude towards America?
How is this any different? I mean, like, we spent so long in the beginning of the pandemic talking about people's abject refusal to acknowledge science and put on a mask and protect people. We're like the capital of death in the world from COVID. And it's the same logic. I don't know that it changed anything. It just we have created a world in which we believe that personal freedom supersedes collective responsibility, and this is the consequence of that.
And yeah, I'm not saying it's any different. I'm saying it's more to the point. But I guess my question that I'm asking you is, this is such an Elisa Gabriela Berger question. How does that make you feel? How does it make you feel to live in a country that has not only passed the million marker of COVID deaths, but also all this gun violence death, and we're just so paralyzed by it? How does it make you feel, and is there any legitimate hope in that story?
No, what I'm saying, although Alice is right regarding the COVID thing, I think that in history, COVID is something more recent. The guns and America go way back. On this culture of shooting, mass shooting. When was Columbine? In which year was Columbine? I don't know.
I was in 4th grade.
What?
I was
Right.
in 4th grade.
So we are talking about what? 5 years ago? No, just kidding. So we are talking about 25 years ago, something like
Right.
that. Okay. So it's a much deeper, issue in America that it's part of the society, and it's such a huge country, and I mean, I hate to say this, but we in Massachusetts and in the Northeast sort of are in a bubble regarding that.
Right. And Eliza, so it's very tempting when you're in this bubble. I mean, we're in a state, a commonwealth that is sane and grounded and thoughtful, where vast majority of folks hate what's happening with mass violence and love our children and want to protect our children from gun violence. And so there's no guarantees, obviously, but we live in a state whose citizens get it. But we live in a country, millions of whose citizens do not get it. And I guess my question is, other than retreating into we're actually citizens of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, in the city of Newton, how do we connect citizenship to the United States of America with all of its problematics? And that's what I'm really wrestling with, because the temptation to recoil, to turn inward and say, you know what, if after Santa Fe you still do Uvalde and still you'll fight to the end to let a deranged loner 18-year-old buy an assault rifle. Even now, I just kind of want to like look inward and say, you know what, I'm getting a divorce. I guess that's what I'm trying to wrestle with. Like, I feel like a divorce from our nation, not from our state, not from our commonwealth, but a divorce from our nation, because I can't work with that. Like, if you were married to a spouse who did that kind of unreasonableness, after Uvalde said, no, 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 what's most important is we need more guns, you would say, you know what, this marriage isn't working for me. This marriage isn't working for you. We're just not a pair. We're just not a pair. And wish you well, and I'm going to go my way, you go your way. There are
But
such
not
things as divorce.
necessarily. Like, you might say that I'm getting more out of this relationship than I'm willing to overlook that. And I think when I was in Nashville, I remember one of the first experiences, we drove across the country and we got to a restaurant and it had a big sign on the door that said, please leave your firearms in the car. And I was not used to those signs. And when I worked there as a server, one of the things they trained us in is not making anybody angry enough to shoot you, because there was the high probability that somebody was in the restaurant with a gun. And so if you had to cut somebody off, there was a very delicate way you went about it, because your life could be at risk. And it's just it's a whole different culture. And
Right.
if you're living in that culture, I
In
don't
Tulsa,
think you,
Oklahoma, the guy who had a bad outcome in his back surgery shot his surgeon,
Yeah.
plus 3 other people in the building at that time. Right? So I guess that's my point. So how do you stay married to a country like that?
So I find it, there's something that touches my heart when you say, how do you not get divorced? Because I grew up in California, and the constant conversation as I was growing up was that California should succeed from the rest of the nation, because there were all kinds of challenges and problems, and maybe in fact we should have Southern California split off from Northern California, because the way the resources are shared and not shared is inequitable, and the politics and policies are different. And of course, nobody would ever really, not nobody. There are people who feel this deeply, but nobody would say that would be a good outcome for the world, that we couldn't figure out how to say what we share is greater than what divides us. And I think one of the really important pieces here, just to return to the Akedah on this one, is it's to me, I find it very easy to go to the you're binding your children on the altar, that your guns are more important than your children. And yet there's something in this Abraham story of this sort of willful kind of obliviousness to, no, of course this is going to turn out okay. If only we get more guards, if only we arm teachers, if only we, like, that there's something that we can do, because I can hold both of these principles. I can have these guns, which I feel are for my protection, and I can protect my kids. And in a sense, that's the Abraham failure, as it were, to believe that, oh, don't worry, it's all going to turn out okay. So, and yet this text does turn out all okay. And can we just look at, on page 2, the Heschel poem? It's not a poem, the Heschel reflection about when he was a kid, right, and he was in religious school and he was still crying after Isaac was saved. Right. And the last line is his Rebbe assuring him that, don't worry, an angel can't come too late. And Heschel says, an angel cannot be late, but man made of flesh and blood maybe. And maybe there's some, I know this may be overly naive or overly optimistic, but maybe the way for us to bridge some of our divide is to help to see that man may be too late, and that all these things that we are doing to try to have both may not ultimately come in time.
I want to go back to your wedding, marriage thing. Normally, I would imagine that if you married somebody, you marry because you love that person, right? And you said it in your sermon last week that we have to learn how to hate the position of the other person, but not necessarily hate the other person.
Right.
Right? So I would imagine that if you wake up with somebody every day that, stands in favor of guns, you will have a conversation. You go to couples therapy. It's not that you would say, that's it, you stand for guns, I'm going to divorce you, because there is love behind that.
Right.
Okay? So, the fact that other people feel differently and they don't do anything doesn't mean we have to give up. Doesn't mean that we don't want to live in this country. Doesn't mean that we cannot keep trying. Doesn't mean that we
Right.
cannot even
Right.
find
Right. So
something
I'm
in
not.
common.
Right. So I'm not. Just to be clear, I'm not advocating secession. What I'm asking about is, I'm having an honest conversation. It's not a political statement. I'm not advocating secession. I'm having an honest conversation about how we feel about our country, and having an honest conversation about how love of country is affected when children are regularly massacred, and our nation chooses to do nothing about it.
I mean, I think there's a couple.
And that, let me just finish that.
Sure, I'm sorry.
And I'm asking the question, we have a sacred responsibility to our children. If you fail your children, you're broken, ipso facto by definition. Right? God gives you children to take care of them. They can't take care of themselves. And we as a society are failing our kids. The number that I heard was 330,000 of our children have been personally affected by in the presence of a building when there's a school shooting.
And can I expand that?
Yeah.
Because all of our children have been affected. My children, your children, your children, back
Right.
in the day, your children did drills in school. They literally have drills in
Right.
school, active shooter drills. They
And-
understand that going to school means taking a risk that this will happen
Right.
to them.
And,
let
and
me-
my,
let
and-
me-
let
let
me
me
just
ask you-
finish. So my question is, if you take it as a sacred responsibility to take care of our children, and if we keep failing this in florid ways as a society and as a country, my question is, what does that do to your love of country when there are so many millions of people who can't get their stuff together to fix this?
So
And- yeah,
I-
that's
I
an
have
honest
a
question.
pro-
So
I have a
let me just finish
proposal
one
here.
last thing. So saying don't secede is not responsive to my question. That because seceding is not on the table.
but-
But
okay.
question.
Wait,
let me
wait,
just
wait. I
finish.
was
Yeah.
first.
My question is, what does that do to your love? Obviously, we're in this together, but what does that do to your love of country when we keep failing our kids?
So here's the thing. I grew up, as I told you many times, as I told everybody, I grew up in a very anti-Semitic country. And the majority of people never met a Jew in their lives. And I had so many classmates of mine, in high school, who they say, I hate all the Jews but you, because you are nice. And how many others do you know? Nobody. Okay, so here's the thing. I don't know anybody who owns a gun. I've never met a person in America who owns a gun. I don't know how they think. I don't know why they buy a gun. I don't know anything about that. So we have so let's just do a hypothetical thing. We have so much in common with a conservative congregation, for example, in Texas, a Jewish synagogue in Texas that are conservative. Have a dialogue with them, because many of them probably carry guns to the synagogue. Have a dialogue, because the other alternative is what? Newton. Oh, look at the trees, look at the flowers. We are so lucky to live but we need to do something.
Right. Elias, you might be surprised by the number of people that you know who own a gun here. Just to
I never
to
faced anybody who
bracket
showed
that-
me a gun.
Right,
Yeah.
just to bracket that there are people even within our community who do and who are responsible gun owners. So
I would love to have a dialogue with somebody like
great.
Well, that's
So-
actually, you know what, Elias?
good idea.
That is actually a really intriguing idea to think about a dialogue with a synagogue in Texas on guns and how, because, we know from the Civil War that preachers and congregations in southern cities were pro-slavery. Right? Rabbis used the Torah to justify slavery. Southern congregations were pro-slavery. So you know that, Judaism is always planted in the civilization in which it lives. So there's no doubt that Texas congregations will have congregants who are much more pro-gun than Newton, than our congregants. And which is not to say that there aren't any. I'm sure there are people in our community who do have guns. Who knows how many? I myself have never seen a gun. And I don't know that I know anybody who has a gun. But there surely are some. But it is fair to say that in Texas, the relationship to guns is very different. And that is a fresh idea. Elias, go for it. Please arrange it.
Yeah.
Please arrange it. So I'd love to end.
I only
with-
do music, Wes.
Yeah,
You do
no,
dialogue.
you only do music.
You can sing about the guns. It's your choice.
So here is what I'd love to end with, which is can you come up with a legitimate? I mean, if we assume that the usual pattern will hold, massacre, funerals, dead children, funerals for dead children, hue and cry, outrage, speeches, thoughts and prayers, we need more than thoughts and prayers, and then nothing happens. That's what's happened since you were in the 4th grade at Columbine. After the last gun massacre in Texas, it's easier than ever to get guns. If something like that holds, okay, what do we do to add hope to our country, not just to Newton? That's the question.
Well, I think Elias had the right idea, which is really that giving up is not an option, because if we give up, then we're fearful in our own country, and that's not living. We can't be fearful in our own country. So I think that trying to create and understand dialogue and understand why so many people believe that in the importance of their right of what they consider their right to own guns is, and maybe try to show them how what they do is actually antithetical to protecting their own children, because they may not see that. And the dialogue's a great idea. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, dialogue's always a good answer. Anyone else? Thank you, Elias. Anyone else have any other ideas for a hopeful note?
I mean, I want to say I don't feel a lot of hope right now on this issue. I feel a lot of just deep, excruciating pain. And every day as there is more news, I am just gutted by the news, and that's sometimes rabbis overstate. That's not an overstatement here. It's just profoundly painful. I think we need to hold that pain of living in this country, that it was not inevitable that we would arrive here, and yet we have arrived here, and then we need to go back and sort of deconstruct and find a point, both politically, continuing to advocate politically, to find that point where, when the assault rifle ban lapsed. There are things that we had in this country that we did agree on at one point in time, or when we all served together in our national military and learned a common purpose, or even just the language of common purpose and turning rights into responsibilities. All of that is work that each of us can do every day, because what Heschel says is really true. An angel can't come too late, but a person can, and often does.
Yeah, and our nation has just borne witness to that sad truth ever since. Can I ask Elias for some nigun that is commensurate to this
For
moment?
as long as we have hope, prayer, and a little bit of time to get us there. Hope, prayer, and time. Michelle, you are the optimistic here. So hope, we never lose hope.
Amen.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.